Well, happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Offit Kurman's Remote Rundown. I'm Jim Reese, Director of Business Development at Offit Kurman, and each week I'm joined with labor and employment attorneys Russell Berger, Sarah Sawyer, and Veronica Yu for a conversation about the latest and most relevant employment issues related to COVID-19 and advice for owners and employers on how to best deal with these issues. There have been plenty of developments since last week. So Sarah, how about you kick us off for today's discussion?
Sure, thanks, Jim. So since we spoke last week, there's been some new guidance from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So that's also known as OSHA, and their job is to ensure safe and healthy working conditions for employees by helping set standards that do so. So they came out with some new guidance regarding non-essential businesses returning to work. Really is kind of echoing a lot of things we've seen so far and the CDC's guidance. But the two main things that we saw in this new guidance is one, that they're recommending a phased approach that matches what's going on in your state or local government. So they're recommending keeping an eye on what your local government is doing and then matching what you're doing and what your procedures are with those phases. So they've set forth 3 phases to match state and local phases. Phase 1 includes businesses considering to still making telework widely available when feasible, and considering limiting the number of people in the workplace, maintaining strict social distancing practices, and where feasible, allowing employees to work from home or providing additional accommodations for elderly employees or individuals that are at high risk. Phase 2, they have that telework should still be available where possible. They make a distinction between phase 2 and phase 1 regarding non-essential business travel. So in phase 1, they're recommending that you stay away from non-essential business travel, and that should be limited, whereas phase 2, you can look to resume some business travel, start to ease some of the social distance practicing depending on the type of business. And then phase 3 is going to be, resuming to unrestricted staffing and, really opening back up. So that was one main thing that they covered were the phases. And then another piece was they really dove into what categories reopening plans should address, and then they also provided examples of how to implement them. So that was definitely some helpful guidance that they were able to provide. The couple of main things that they recommend should be included in each reopening policy are hazard assessments, hygiene, social distancing, identification and isolation of sick employees, return to work after illness or exposure, so what to do in those circumstances, and workplace flexibilities, training, and anti-retaliation. So there's these categories that they've gone into good detail in and also given examples of how to implement. So that's been helpful guidance for employers as they are doing what we've been recommending for weeks, putting policies in place to reopen safely.
Yeah, and Sarah ran through, I think it's like 9 principles that the OSHA guidance provides. I didn't count, but I think it's about 9. And one of them that I wanted to just touch on today is identifying and isolating sick employees. And I think this is really critical because you have to depend on your employee to be able to identify their symptoms and report it and make that decision that they're too sick or sick and they shouldn't come to work. And since not all of us have our doctorates, it's sometimes difficult to determine whether they really are having COVID symptoms or a cold or allergies. But your employees should know that it's really important that if they're not feeling well, they should stay home. And just an anecdotal story that recently came up with one of our clients is that an employee reported that she wasn't feeling well, and she did go and get COVID tested. and the testing came back negative. So she returned to work. A few days later, she gets a call from the doctor, and it turns out that the testing was inaccurate and that she'd have to come back in for testing, that she had pneumonia, and that it was very possible that she could be COVID positive. And during that time, she had been interacting with all of her employees. There was an employee meeting held. And so when I got the call from my client, we had to discuss what's the recommended guidance here. And the CDC has guidance that states if someone is suspected of having COVID or test positive for COVID, that anyone who came into close contact with them immediately has to be quarantined and sent home. So the big concern was this meeting that they had. And essentially, as a result of that meeting, they had to pretty much close down and operate, bare bones as a result of it. And the definition of close contact in the CDC is less than 6 feet for a period longer than 15 minutes. And, a staff meeting will do that. And so you can't just take your employees' word sometimes. So you have to make sure that they're trained and that others around you in the workplace understand how important it is to identify these symptoms, not just to slow the spread of coronavirus, but also to protect your business from those implications. I'd also just point out that the OSHA guidelines make it very clear that these are recommendations. They don't change any legal obligations. So that may, have a business owner thinking, okay, well, this isn't mandatory, so I don't have to follow it. And I would really strongly recommend that you do your best to adhere to the guidance, because, you could be liable under, other negligence theories or under OSHA traditional guidelines for not keeping a safe workplace, if you can't manage the health of your workplace. So even though they are not mandatory, I would strongly recommend adhering to them.
Yeah, and that's a good point because as I mentioned a few weeks ago on the remote rundown, we had there was a case out in Illinois where employees and family members of employees were seeking an injunction against McDonald's to require certain workplace safety measures be implemented and actually enforced. And just this week, there was a decision actually granting that injunction on a public nuisance theory. So while the OSHA guideline is not mandatory, the CDC guidelines are not mandatory. The only things that are mandatory are the state executive orders that governors and in some cases mayors and county executives have been implementing across the country. The reality is that now there's this other avenue where employees have had at least one case where they've been successful at enforcing at forcing an employer to enhance the protective measures that they're taking. And you don't want to be in a position where instead of trying to enforce those protective measures, the employees are trying to recover some kind of damage or come after you for a greater liability exposure.
Okay, well, this looks like a good place to pause. I'd like each of you to leave us with your thought of the day, your takeaway from today's discussion. And why don't we start with Veronica with your takeaway from today's discussion?
My takeaway, which was very relevant at the start of all of the pandemic and is just as relevant now as we're going further into reopening, is to stay informed. There's a lot of information out there, and we may have gotten fatigued as the pandemic first rolled out, but the guidance is still coming. As of June, I think 11th, the EEOC issued additional guidance. The counties are issuing different guidance, which would be different than what the state of Maryland is providing. So you have to stay informed, and whether that's making one point person or a task force to keep track of all of this and keep you apprised of the updates, I think that's a really great first step to staying on top of everything.
Sarah?
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, it's to stay informed and also stay vigilant in your workplace. So putting the policies in place and then just, putting them on the shelf is not going to be sufficient. You really want to make sure that people are actually complying with the policies and the rules that you put in place, and that they're abiding by the rules, and that they're reminded of what the responsibilities are and what they should be doing. So again, as things get to feel more and more normal, there's more and more risk that people will forget what they're supposed to do or pay less attention.
Russell.
Yeah, well, based on the story Veronica told, I would be very careful about what you do in the office or in your workplace. And I wouldn't have any all hands meetings. If I did, it'd be virtual. And I wouldn't take any chances. I'd be very conservative about putting employees together, because that really exacerbates the risk to continuity of operations.
Excellent. Thank you all. Let's end it with our trivia question. We're going to start with Russell. Russell, what's the craziest thing that's happened to you on a Zoom call?
I was on a couple where one, I saw a dog running around in the background and hopping on the keyboard. And then I was on a totally different one where I saw a cat actually cross the person's keyboard. So, I mean, I can't believe that something like that could ever happen.
I think I witnessed both of them. Sarah, how about you? And you can't use those two examples.
I know, the cat's always my go-to. I did have someone, I've been doing a couple of virtual coffees, and I did have someone that I was having a virtual coffee with, and I won't call out who they are, obviously, but still an entire cup of like iced coffee on the lap. But I didn't really see it happen because it was below the screen, so I just got to see the facial expressions and wonder what was going on. And then we had to take a little break so that there could be some cleanup. So. Did
you see the smoke rising from the keyboard?
Yeah. It all worked out. I don't think anything was damaged, but it made for at least a comical start to the conversation.
All right. And Veronica, no cats or dogs. Anything interesting?
No, other than Ellie, everything's been great. But I could definitely tell you a bunch of stories about her.
Well, Ellie is welcome to join us anytime. She's very well behaved. Sometimes, better than humans, I'm sure. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week on Remote Rundown.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, guys.